Hey, welcome to the new episode. If you're watching, you're probably a fan of the Commodore 64. You're in good company because I am too. Today, I'm going to try to answer the question of how many Commodore 64 computers were sold. Now, this question has been answered several times over the years, and the answers range from, I think, 12 million the whole way up to 30 million. So hopefully we can get it a little bit closer than that today. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you probably remember that I actually did this video a couple years ago. I'm taking a fresh look at it today, and hopefully I can get you better numbers. I actually put a little bit more effort into it to dig in and try to see what the C128 sales trends were so that we can split those out from the C64 numbers, which I didn't do in the last video. I also got a little bit more documentation since I did the last one, so let's see how this one turns out. Stick with me. I want to make sure this video is as accurate as it can possibly be because I don't want to have to revisit this topic again. So I called on Don Greenbaum, the former treasurer of Commodore International, for his advice. So Don, I'm doing this video about how many Commodore 64s were sold throughout the history of the company, and I'm using Commodore's annual reports as the main source for my data. So how did Commodore count those things? What was the corporate structure and how did sales work and how accurate are those counts?
So in order to understand the actual numbers, let's look at the corporate structure. You have Commodore International Limited, which I was treasurer at the time you're looking at, and below that, Commodore Electronics Limited. Now, the manufacture of the motherboards, which was the basis for the count of the sale of C64s, happened in Hong Kong. The motherboards would be shipped to the various manufacturing facilities, the biggest which was Braunschweig and Westchester, Pennsylvania. So the counts start with the motherboard production. And because Commodore Electronic Limited is Hong Kong, Basel, which accounted for all the sales of Europe, and the manufacturing under CEL through another holding company, the US, let's say they produce 1 million motherboards. Then they ship them out to CEL, which in turn is the manufacturing locations. You have sales per year. The big sales season, of course, being Christmas worldwide. And then, because of the way Commodore sold units, they register the sale, let's say, when they ship them to Kmart. The sales are done. If for some reason there are product returns and faulty units, they come back to Commodore subsidiaries, they get refurbished and sold again. Now, since Commodore is on a June 30 fiscal, a lot of that transactional back and forth of sales, returns, and what have you is mostly done by June 30th. So if you're looking at sales based on June 30th as the fiscal year, not the calendar year as you did, you have the annual report as the accurate reporting of sales. So you took your numbers from the annual report. That is the most accurate because if you look at the production by the subsidiaries of CEL, that might include a lot of products still in inventory. So if CEL ships 5 million, well, it wouldn't have been 5 million, 1.5 million or 2 million motherboards, that is a sale on CEL's books, but they may still be in the subsidiary. So if you have any discrepancy between what I gave you in those reports we collected in Westchester and CEL numbers, and you go, wait a minute, some numbers don't totally add up, it's because it's an inventory.
Okay.
So
by counting the annual reports, how trustworthy are they? Because I mean, Commodore was a public company. They wanted people to invest in the stock. There's incentive to say we sold, 20 zillion of these things. What prevents them
well,
from doing that?
if you exaggerate the sales to shareholders, you get shareholder suits. So it is much more accurate in looking what Irving Gould signs as a sales number for the public and the SEC filings. That's more accurate than what CEL numbers might show in what I gave you.
Thank you so much, Don. What Don was referring to at the end by what he gave me is a whole slew of internal reports and financial information he saved from his time at Commodore. Don mailed me a 17-pound box of documents that have all been scanned and uploaded to the Internet Archive, so any reports I show in this video are out there for anyone to look at. I'll put a link in the video description. I used Commodore's annual reports to shareholders as my primary source of information, and they provide almost everything we need. And based on what Don said, they're going to be the most accurate source of information we'll find. There is one challenge, though. Commodore reported C64 and C128 sales together as the C64 family of products in their annual reports. But don't worry, by the end of the video, I'll have separate counts for you. Where the annual reports to shareholders are lacking information, we can look to the reports that Don sent me. A company's fiscal year isn't necessarily aligned with the calendar year. Because I'm using Commodore's annual reports to shareholders as a primary source of information, and because those were published at the conclusion of each fiscal year, I'll be reporting data by fiscal year, not calendar year. Commodore's fiscal year ran from July 1 through June 30, so fiscal year 1982, as shown here, ran from July 1, 1981 through June 30, 1982. We know the Commodore 64 was released in August of 1982, which was in Commodore's 1983 fiscal year. As such, the count for Commodore 64 sold in fiscal year 1982 is 0. To get a total for FY83, I'll need to combine data from several different sources. I'll start with the 1983 annual report. On page 10, we learn that as of January 1983, the VIC-20 has sold over 1 million units, and the Commodore 64 is rapidly moving toward that level. Okay, so this tells us the C64 has sold fewer than 1 million units in FY83. We need to do better than that. The next document we'll look at is an internal report Don Greenbaum sent to me. It's an international bank presentation that Commodore prepared in June 1984 for banks they were attempting to borrow from. The current company profile section at C3 has a helpful bit of information. Here we go. Just under 3 million 64s have been sold worldwide. This report was from June 1984, which is right at the tail end of fiscal year 1984. So now we know that 3 million total were sold in FY83 and FY84 combined. And recall from the FY83 annual report, we know that fewer than 1 million were sold in FY83. I'll look at one more data source to allow us to wrap up FY83, and that is Commodore's 1986 annual report to shareholders. If we turn to page 13, we'll find that unit sales of the C64 were 2.5 million in 1984. Great, so if we know combined FY83 and FY84 were 3 million, and we now know that FY84 was 2.5 million, that means they sold 500,000 Commodore 64 units in FY83. Moving right along to FY84, it doesn't get any easier than this because I literally just read it. Unit sales of the C64 were 2.5 million in 1984. That brings our running total to 3 million, and the 1986 annual report is the gift that keeps on giving as we move along to FY 1985. That's right, in the very same sentence. And almost 2 million in 1985, which brings our running total up to 5 million Commodore 64s sold by the end of FY85. Moving on to fiscal year 1986, this is where we see the first instance of something I mentioned earlier in the video. The C64 and C128 numbers are combined in Commodore's annual reports as a single product group. Now don't worry, we'll address this by the end of the video. For now, just know that for the years where the C128 was on the market, we'll be lumping the C128 numbers in with C64 unit sales. Anyway, we're still looking at the 1986 annual report. It's been a goldmine of information, and we didn't even need to turn the page. Right here, it tells us combined sales of the C64 and C128 were 1.9 million units in fiscal 1986. This brings our running total to 6.9 million units sold. On to fiscal year 1987, and I'll be using the 1987 annual report to shareholders as a data source. On page 2, this is where we run into our first problem. Our current running total is 6.9 million units sold by the end of FY86. In the FY87 annual report, it says, The size and global scope of the installed user base for the 64/128 product line, some 7 million worldwide, reflects its continuing success. Did they only sell 100,000 combined C64 and C128 in FY87? I'm going to rewind our running total back to 1985 for a moment here and take a look at the 1985 annual report. Apologies, I only have this one on microfiche, so you don't get the pretty full color scan. Turn to page 3 and the first sentence says, the sale of 5 million Commodore 64s. Good. The total listed in the FY85 annual report matches our running total for FY85. Jumping ahead to the FY86 report again, 1.9 million, our running total is correct at 6.9 million. If we look at the 1988 annual report, it reveals that Commodore made a mistake in their FY87 annual report. Here we go. The C64, C128D computers, the traditional Commodore products, are aimed at the home and education sectors. The most successful home computers ever sold, they currently have an installed base of over 9 million units. Approximately 1 million were sold this year. At the end of FY86, the installed base was 6.9 million. At the end of FY88, the installed base was 9 million, but only 1 million were sold in FY88. From this, we can derive that 1.1 million were sold in FY87, resulting in an installed base of 8 million by the end of FY87. And that makes FY88 easy, now doesn't it? Here we are already looking at the FY88 annual report, and as I already mentioned, 1 million sold for a total installed base of 9 million. 1989's easy, so let's not spend a lot of time on it. I'm using the 1989 annual report as my data source here, and we turn to page 3 to see, with an installed base exceeding 10 million units and a software library of approximately 10,000 published titles, they remain the most popular computers ever built. Over 1 million units were sold in 1989. Everything is tracking still, and our running total for the end of FY89 is 10 million units. I'll use Commodore's 1990 annual report as the primary data source for FY90, and there are no surprises waiting for us. We get the goods right on page 2. Although sales of the Commodore 64 declined for the year, we nonetheless sold over 700,000 units. This sales performance was impressive in as much as the C64 was introduced over 8 years ago. Do note, the C128 was discontinued in FY89, so C128 numbers are no longer included here. This brings our running total to 10.7 million units by the end of FY90. I'll skip ahead to the 1993 annual report to shareholders to save us a few minutes because it contains unit sales for 91, 92, and 93 all in one paragraph, and we find that right here on page 2. C64 products accounted for only 4% of net sales in fiscal 1993, compared with 13% in fiscal 92 and 16% in fiscal 1991. In fiscal 93, C64 unit sales declined to less than 200,000 units, compared with 650,000 units in fiscal 1992 and over 800,000 units in fiscal 1991. Wonderful, so let's update the running total here. 800,000 units in fiscal 1991 puts us at 11,500,000. 650,000 units in fiscal 92 puts us at 12,150,000. 200,000 units in fiscal 93, and that lands us right at 12,350,000. Commodore declared bankruptcy on April 29, 1994 in the fourth quarter of their fiscal year. So we need to account for C64s sold from July 1st, 93 through April 29, 94. There is no 94 annual report because Commodore didn't survive FY94. We need some other documentation to get the FY94 unit sales. For that, I'll turn to a document that came from Gerard Bucas, the former president of Great Valley Products, by way of my friend Robert Miranda, who used to work for GVP. It shows unit sales for FY92, FY93, and the 6-month period from July 1st, 1993 through the end of December 93. Unfortunately, the unit sales section doesn't list the C64. However, down here in the revenue section, the C64 is listed. I'd have no way to derive units from revenue, but that doesn't matter because there wasn't any C64 revenue after July 1, 93. That means 0 units. The C64 was officially discontinued as of July 1, 1993. I don't need to update the running total. It remains at 12,350,000 through the death of Commodore in April '94. Here's the final tally showing C64 and C128 combined sales from fiscal year 82 through fiscal year 94. I showed you all my sources, and it's data that Commodore reported publicly to anyone who was a stockholder. I just took the exact information Commodore provided over the years and compiled that to arrive at these numbers. I'm confident in saying that Commodore sold 12,350,000 combined Commodore 64 and Commodore 128 throughout their lifetime. But this still doesn't tell us how many Commodore 64 were sold. We need to be able to separate 64 and 128 unit sales. Let's see what we can do about that now. Once again, I'll refer to Commodore's 1986 annual report to shareholders, this time on page 3 in Tom Radigan and Irving Gould's letter to shareholders. And there it is. Over 700,000 units of the Commodore 128/128D have been sold since the launch last fall. Okay, so we know they sold 700,000 C128s in fiscal year 1986. Let's update this table to begin separating out C64 and C28 figures with the data we have. To complete this video, I need to come up with numbers for FY87 through FY89, and as of today, I don't have any source for those exact numbers. I'll do the best I can to make educated guesses based on whatever information I do have, starting with detailed unit sales reports for FY86. Sure, we already have the 700,000 C128 number for FY86, but let's take a look at some of the detailed data behind that and see if maybe it can tell us something. What you're looking at here is a document that Don Greenbaum provided. It's the supporting work papers from Commodore's 1986 financial plan, and the first section is product sales for calendar years 1984 and 1985. Up here we get the full 2-year range of C64 unit sales separated geographically by US and the rest of the world. Down here is the C128 data. The 128 wasn't released until Q3 in calendar 1985, and the 128D wasn't released until Q4, so everything prior to that is 0. Remember, Q3 calendar 1985 is Q1 fiscal 1986, so we have detailed C128 unit sales for Q1 and Q2 of fiscal year 1986. I'll get Q3 FY86 from this document. It's a revised 1986 financial plan, so a follow-up to the original 1986 financial plan we just looked at. The original was created in February 1986, this one in May 1986. I'll turn to page 7 of this report and you'll see that once again we have the C64 and C128 unit sales data we're after. The only column we can use in this report is the actual 33186 column. These are the unit sales totals for January, February, and March 1986, which is Q3 of fiscal year 1986. The rest of the data in this report is projected data, so we can't use that. But I'll grab the C64 and C128 Q3 FY86 unit sales and use those. Now, this page of the report is only US numbers. The rest of the world numbers are on the next page. I'll grab C64 and C128 unit sales for Q3 for non-US, and I'll also grab the C64 bundle unit sales. That means they bundled a C64 with a tape drive, but it still counts as a C64 sale. We now have detailed C64 and C128 unit sales figures for Q1, Q2, and Q3 of fiscal year 1986. I have one more document left. It's a sales and inventory report faxed from Commodore Electronics Limited in Hong Kong for the week ending June 7, 1986. I'll turn to page 3 of 9 of the report, which was apparently page 12 of the original fax. We want the worldwide numbers over here on the right, and notice it's Q4 actual to date. The report is 4th quarter to 5/31/1986. Well, Q4 ran through June 30, 1986, so we'll be missing 1 month of Q4 data. I'll get the C64 and C128 unit sales figures from this report, and I'll compile everything into a single report to make it easier for us to examine. Here we go. I included FY85 just for fun, but we're only talking about FY86 in this video. As I mentioned, I'm missing the last month of FY86 data. It's difficult to derive a lot of meaning from these numbers because it's a small sample set, the C128's a brand new product, and there's a Christmas shopping season thrown in the mix. It makes sense that the C64 had higher average sales because it was already a well-established product. Likewise, it's not surprising the C128 was more variable. It was a newly launched product. What I do find interesting is the percentage difference between C64 and C128 unit sales. In Q1, the C128, it's a brand new product and its sales were within 50% of the C64. Q2, the holiday shopping season, and the C128 closed the gap and pulled within 21.95% of the C64's unit sales. But then look what happens after Christmas. The C128 quickly drops back to 54.95%, and then in the final 2 months of data, the gap widens to almost 64%. In the limited data set we have, unit sales are trending very poorly for the C128 as compared to the C64. I'm not yet prepared to model FY87 through FY89 separate C64 and C128 unit sales data on this data analysis. For all we know, maybe the C128 made a huge comeback in FY87 and surpassed C64 sales. I'll finish my analysis by looking at a couple documents that don't provide raw numbers, but they will illustrate how unit sales were trending for the C128 and C64. This internal document provided by Don Greenbaum describes Commodore's product strategy as of May 1986. Remember, the C28 was released in July 85, so not even 1 year prior. And what's Commodore planning regarding the Commodore 128? Phasing it out. This next page provides additional insight. The wording here, quote, phase out C128, focus on C64 enhancement, offering equal performance to C128 to halt and potentially reverse volume decline. This indicates that C128 sales were tanking, and Commodore felt like it was also dragging the C64 down with it. So by phasing out the C128, Commodore hoped to reinvigorate C64 sales. This is a big deal. Commodore wasn't talking about phasing out the entire C64 and C128 8-bit family in favor of the Amiga, and they also weren't talking about phasing out the older C64 to push the newer C128. They still felt there was money to be made with the 8-bit line, but with the C64, not the C128. One more bit of anecdotal information comes from Commodore's winter 1986 corporate newsletter. There's a story on page 15 about the Commodore 128. Quote, the launch of the compatible C128 has not only endorsed the future for potential buyers of the C64, but has also offered them an upgrade path. The result has been a great upsurge in sales of the C64 in the recent Christmas market, along with good sales of the C128. Commodore 64 sales have been so strong that despite large inventories only a few months ago, there have been shortages in supplies recently and production has been turned up again to meet the renewed demand. So C64 sales temporarily lagged, likely because of the 128, but then they picked back up again. So it sure doesn't seem like there was any miraculous C128 unit sales resurgence going on. I'm prepared to fill in the gaps for C128 unit sales. We need to provide numbers for FY86 through FY89, the years when the C128 was on the market. We only have stated unit sales from Commodore for FY86, so I'm using my own estimates for FY87 through FY89. I'm basing my estimates on three things. One, I can project the FY86 detailed unit sales out through FY89. And 2 and 3 are really the same thing. Based on anecdotal evidence, there was never a course correction to the slumping FY86 C128 sales, so I don't need to adjust my FY86 forward projections. Without further ado, here are my C64 and C128 unit sales numbers updated for 2025. From fiscal year 1982 through the death of Commodore in fiscal year 1994, they sold 10,594,000 Commodore 64 computers, and they sold 1,756,000 Commodore 128 computers, amounting to a grand total of 12,350,000 combined Commodore 64 and Commodore 128 computers.
So there you have the final numbers, and I know what you're thinking, but what about? Because when I published the last video, I got a lot of comments that said, but what about Dreen? But what about SX64? But what about this? So I made sure to ask Don Greenbaum a few questions while I had him.
There were Commodore 64s sold in Argentina by Dreen, so they were Dreen branded. How were those accounted for, or were they accounted for?
They were accounted in royalties. Now, CEL did sell them motherboards, and Dreen would assemble the units per se. But I believe they made their own stampings for the cases and the power supplies. So you can't really, you can look at the units, in that, and that's how they were accounted for. But you can't look in the sales numbers to get that
Okay.
number.
Would those numbers show up in the annual report numbers though, when Commodore said, 1 million units were sold
Yes,
this year? Okay,
that's in the,
that would be
because that's
included.
taken from the motherboard.
Got it.
Yes.
Then how about SX64s? And it probably doesn't matter because the overall
It is
number is
insignificant when you're looking at 10 or plus million
Yeah.
units.
Okay, but you don't know specifically, did they count SX64 in those numbers?
I don't believe we thought it significant enough to break it out in the reports I gave you, which were mostly done for the board, not the public.
Right. Okay. Dawn, I think that's everything I wanted to ask.
Cool.
Anything else you wanted to say that we should put out there?
No, I think the C64 lived a lot longer than management, including me, thought it would. We brought out the 128, which could have been a success, but the timing was that the 128 raised the price point at a point where IBM brought out their PC Junior, which failed, and they dumped them on the market at a price point even below the 128. So the 128 died, but the C64 lived on.